Hey friends, Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with historian, journalist Garrett Graff. We're discussing season 4 of his podcast. His podcast is called The Long Shadow, and this new season is called Breaking the Internet. This is a fascinating conversation. It's one that I think if folks are not familiar with what this story entails, everybody ought to get informed ASAP. Garrett's a really brilliant young guy. He's already written like 10 major books, and this podcast series especially is really fascinating. So, Garrett Graff, here it is. Enjoy. Fascinating.
Poetry has the power to connect our inner universe and the outer world. I'm Maggie Smith, poet and host of The Slowdown, a podcast from American Public Media. Each weekday, find time to take a breather from your to-do list, or doom scrolling for that matter, and take in a moment of reflection with a hand-picked poem. Listen to The Slowdown wherever you get podcasts.
I love the autumn. I just spent a weekend with a friend cutting and splitting firewood for the winter. With the days getting shorter, the summer chores fewer, and the fall colors on their way, everything seems to be slowing down. Just delightful. And then in the midst of all those creature comforts are yet another, our new Bowl and Branch signature sheets. Yes, those Bowl and Branch signature sheets are buttery soft, breathable to sleep in, and made with the highest quality 100% organic cotton in durable designs, and come with a 30-night worry-free guarantee. We are indeed having no worries and a great deal of delight with our new Bowl and Branch sheets. So start building your sanctuary of comfort this fall with Bowl and Branch. For a limited time, get 20% off your first set of sheets plus free shipping at bowlandbranch.com/NSE. That's Bowl and Branch, BOLLAND, branch.com/NSE to save 20% and unlock free shipping. Exclusions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Garrett Graff is a best-selling historian, former Politico magazine editor, longtime Wired contributor, and host of the Edward R. Murrow award-winning podcast Long Shadow. In Season 4, Breaking the Internet, he traces 3 decades in which the Internet moved from civic promise to existential crisis. Welcome, Garrett.
Thanks so much for having me.
Very pleased to have you. Looking forward to the conversation today. You say in your bio on your website, or it says in your bio on your website, throughout his career and work, Graff remains committed to one guiding idea, that understanding history is not a luxury, it's a civic responsibility. And so let me ask to start, why is understanding the history of the Internet a civic responsibility, you think?
It's a great question, and I think it has a lot to do with why we chose the internet and the rise and fall of social media as the topic for this season, which is every year on Long Shadow, we try to pick a big public policy issue and try to explain why America is the way that it is. And I think what we try to do is look back over the last 40 or 50 years and use history to tell that story of today. And, the way that our country is, the way that our culture is, the way that our government is, as Kamala Harris might say, is not because we just fell out of a coconut tree. It is because of decisions made by specific people at specific moments in our past. And we tried to go back and trace that to explain how we ended up the way that we are. And I think when you look across civic life right now in the United States, the biggest challenge that we have as a country is the way that social media is driving political polarization, the way that it is driving a collapse of truth and fact-based information ecosystems, the way that it is powering the rise of conspiracism, and the way that this tool that, when I started off in my early tech and journalism career 25 years ago, was something that appeared to have so much promise to bring us together, to drive transparency and accountability for elected officials and in government, has instead turned into something that is driving us all apart as Americans and as a world. And so our goal for this season was to go back and sort of look at how those decisions got made and how we ended up in the sort of toxic cesspool of online hate, harassment, and misogyny that I think most of us now see on a near daily basis online.
Yeah. We're going to have opportunity to dig into a lot of the particulars of that. But before we do that, let me ask one follow-up here. Why do you think, and you're given all of the historical work that you do, why do you think Americans, it seems in particular, are so reticent to take history seriously? Or why is there sort of dismissal, perhaps? Or is there? Is that a fair thing to say about our fellow citizens?
I think a lot of it has to do with America's sense of exceptionalism, sort of our sense that as a country, a people, and a culture, we are distinct and better than the civilizations and the countries that have come before us. And in that sense, that we are more masters of our own destiny in our moment than I think many of us actually are. That they're, the sort of abiding dream of America has always been this sort of two-pronged promise that every generation lives a life better than the generation that came before it, and that we can all Horatio Alger style pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, America is a place of sort of unfettered opportunity and promise. And I think that in believing all of that, in sort of wrapping our nation in that mythology, we have done a disservice to how much our future is driven by our past.
So with the new season of Long Shadow and looking at the internet, it seems to me that one way to summarize or capture the rhythm of that storytelling that you do is you sketch. The sketch basically often looks like we have this constructive promise that gets made by the technology, and there seems to be some payout in a positive, constructive way socially, and then the next thing we know, a much worse unanticipated turn occurs, and that then it happens again and again and again and again. Is that a fair way to kind of summarize the way the storytelling works?
Yeah, and I think that is, one of the hardest things with this season. I started my tech and journalism career in the early 2000s, right at the dawn of social media and Google and YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. And trying to go back now and explain in the podcast just how promising and exciting those early years actually felt to be a part of, from this moment in 2025 where, the internet, we have such, mixed feelings about the role of our daily internet lives, and sort of this self-hate that comes from our own addictions to, Instagram and Twitter and TikTok or what have you, that, we can sort of, we recognize that these things are not bringing joy into our lives anymore. We still use them. We still are, medically or not, addicted to them as tools in our daily lives. But, I don't think a lot of us sign on in the morning sort of full of hope and optimism and promise about what the internet is going to bring us on a daily basis now. And yet that really was the feeling of the early 2000s. And so trying to tell that story across the season and remind people, many of whom, in their 20s and 30s today, have never known that period of promise and excitement online, was a real challenge.
Yeah. So let's look at some of those rhythms there, from hope to loss of hope. Could you maybe sketch out for us first the way in which the internet gave us such promising possibilities in the midst of the Arab Spring, for example?
Yeah. And I think that period from the sort of late 2000s through the early 2010s was probably the peak of the promise of the internet. And, here in the US, we saw, internet enthusiasm drive changes in our national politics and deliver the presidency to Barack Obama. We saw this sort of generational promise of a wired youth around the world who were going to be able to use these tools to upend authoritarianism and upend dictatorships, a promise that really came to fruition in the early period of the Arab Spring, where you saw Twitter and Facebook and these other social media and internet tools really be a key part of the foundation of revolutions in places like Tunisia and most notably in Egypt and elsewhere, and these sort of Middle Eastern dictatorships that had seemed completely unmovable until the arrival of internet organizing allowed for a stream of information and offline organizing to take place that through online tools that completely upended these governments and overturned dictatorships. And so we build in up to the third episode of this season, looking at that Arab Spring moment, primarily through the eyes of both reporters who covered the Arab Spring and in Egypt and the protests in and around Tahrir Square, but also the young organizers who actually were able to use these tools to take on an entire authoritarian regime sort of independently, with incredible bravery and personal heroism, often at great personal cost. I mean, these protest organizers were arrested and tortured and beaten and imprisoned, sometimes for years. But the nature of online organizing meant that it was diffuse enough. The leadership structures were diffuse enough and broad enough and easy enough to use that the government couldn't control them in the way that they had been used to controlling state-owned media for the decades up until the arrival of the internet and social media.
Yeah, those stories that you tell are just remarkable about the ways in which as you said, the courage and the ingenuity in using the internet is just so remarkable, and what they're able to pull off in a way that obviously couldn't have been done before. And yet, then again, the story then unfolds so that that very same mechanism then becomes the mechanism of authoritarian repression. So, for those who are not so familiar with that part of the story, kind of unpack some of that for us.
Yeah, and it was a switch that you began to see relatively quickly in the mid part of the 2010s, where authoritarian governments began to understand how they could use the internet and use social media basically to control populations in the same way that populations had been originally using them to upend authoritarian dictatorships and demand transparency and accountability. And that in some ways, the way that the internet was evolving, which was this idea that it was a tool that could that was no longer user driven but algorithm driven, that algorithm actually encouraged polarization. It encouraged enragement, and it encouraged the weaponization of existing seams in society, and that it was sort of something that you could use both to spread misinformation and disinformation and conspiracies, but also to attack democracies. And this is really the insight that Russia had in 2016 ahead of the U.S. presidential election, where the Russian government began to understand how to turn, bots and trolls on Twitter and Facebook into driving division and polarization in the United States. That I think there's a misunderstanding in some ways that Twitter trolls and bots can create new divisions, but they don't really create new divisions. What they're able to do is exacerbate and inflame existing seams in political debate, in existing seams in polarizing topics and content. And that was what Russia was able to do at mass scale in 2016, and in the run-up to 2016, both inside Russia, which I think is sort of part of the interesting story, and the way that they perfected many of these tactics in spreading sort of pro-Putin propaganda internally, domestically inside Russia, to bolster his political standing inside the country, and then began to turn those tools to more move against politics in the United States.
So the decision to front end or popularize outrage algorithms. Talk to us about that. How conscious were decisions made by social media companies, for example, to allow outrage to become a primary mechanism in what it put forward and what it is going to push toward the top of a newsfeed?
This is actually probably, for me, the most interesting part about writing and researching Long Shadow every year, is the way that you're able to take these giant subjects, these things that seem all-encompassing. Across 3 seasons, we've looked at the rise of the far right, the rise of gun violence in the United States, and now in this fourth season, the rise and fall of social media, and the way that you really begin to understand that these giant topics are changed and driven by specific people making specific decisions in specific moments in specific meetings, and that you're sort of able to trace back all of this to this is the date and the time that this whole thing changed. And that to me, I've lived, most of this tech revolution myself, and in my own career, I've written books about it. I spent almost a decade as a contributor at Wired writing about it. And yet even I was surprised at how deliberate the decision-making around the polarization of content online, and particularly on social media, turns out to be. And what I mean by that is there was this period in the early 2000s where the user was really in control of the content that they saw online. That you went to blogs that you liked and watched it, or you went to blogs that you liked and read the content. You, in the early Facebook era, most people don't even remember this. You actually had to go to your friends' individual pages to see what they were up to. And on YouTube, you could watch a video, but you had to really search that video out. You needed to have that shared to you by someone in a, trusted circle that, sent you the link, to watch this video. And so on a daily basis, you were really curating your own online information diet, and you were in charge of where the content came from that you wanted to consume. And that begins to change by the end of the 2000s as these social media companies, first Facebook and then Twitter and others, began to move away from a user-generated model or a user-driven model to an algorithm-driven model. And this is where we get what is now, the Facebook news feed. The idea that there is this feed of, all the content that is coming onto Facebook from your friends or others, that might be popular among people that you follow or are friends with, and that it's sort of all presented to you. And that this really drives, this change begins to drive from a very simple business decision that these tech companies make, which is they are not going to be user revenue driven. They're not going to be subscription based. As a Facebook user, you pay nothing for the service. And so what that means is you're the product, and that you are the thing that Facebook is selling to someone else. And that Facebook turns to this advertiser driven model, which means that if they are going to rely on ads and not subscriptions, they need people to stay on the website for as long as they can, in order to sell as many ads as they can. And that, Facebook becomes all about how do we maximize eyeballs on the Facebook newsfeed. And what they figure out is the algorithm, and that the way that They log every interaction that you have with the website and all of the other websites that you follow across the rest of the internet through cookies, and sort of back-end data accumulation, means that they're trying to figure out in very careful and nuanced ways what are the things that are going to keep this particular person looking at this website longer. And what they come to determine very quickly is that content that makes us angry, content that we don't like seeing, content that enrages us, actually makes us stick around longer. That people are more likely to engage with and share and react to and comment on and watch content that enrages them. And that over time, what ends up happening is these algorithmically driven news feeds on social media websites become incredibly sophisticatedly curated to enrage us. Because and at one point, Facebook is weighting in its algorithm the equivalent of the dislike button 5 times as powerfully as they're rating and weighting the like button. So if you see something on your Facebook news feed that you don't like and tell Facebook that, then that carries, you are sort of 5 times more likely to see more content like that.
Fascinating.
Than you are something that you actually want to, that makes you happy and joyful and, kittens and unicorns and rainbows. Although, maybe for some listeners out there, kittens, rainbows, and unicorns are enraging, in which case you will see more of those. But that, this becomes this like very simple business decision of we're going to rely on advertisers that then leads to, which means we need people to stay on the site as long as they can, which leads to what keeps people around is content that makes them even angrier. And you sort of see in like very few steps, this very quick pivot of the web and social media to this moment, where we are now, a decade or more into now, where sort of the entire social media world is now geared towards enraging us.
Yeah, and this obviously is not merely a matter of individual rage, but has very far-reaching social consequences as you play out in numerous ways. And there's several quite distressing examples of this. But share with us, for example, the impact that this had upon Myanmar and the story there.
Yeah. One of the things that you begin to see over the course of the 2010s is this way that this enraging content spreads around the world. And there is no more horrific example of that than in Myanmar, which was for a very brief period of time, more than a decade ago, seen as this sort of rising moment of, democracy and promise and hope, and then begins to really largely through sort of politically driven hate offline in politics in Myanmar against the Rohingya minority that begins to spread online, particularly on Facebook, where in a way that's similar to a lot of developing countries in the 2010s, there really is no internet beyond Facebook. I think one of the things we misunderstand in the West is, for us, Facebook is sort of one website among many. And that for much of the world beyond, particularly places with less connectivity, less desktop computer usage, where the internet is sort of more a mobile first phenomenon, Facebook can be basically the entire internet in some countries, and that Facebook did not do a good job of policing the content that was spreading in sort of local languages in Myanmar. They did not have the personnel or the practices and policies in place to stop a really viral hate speech and from spreading online. And it resulted in and helped contribute to a genocide against the people, the Rohingya people in Myanmar. One of the sort of great human rights catastrophes and atrocities of the decade. And, a UN investigation very firmly pointed the finger at Facebook afterward for basically saying, that Facebook was the cause of, lighting this bonfire, and helped sort of pour gasoline on this bonfire in Myanmar. And it was that, along with the Russian attack on the 2016 election here in the United States, I think really spurred Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook executives after 2016 to have this moment of conscience where they were sort of trying to figure out how to do this better, and worried about their own complicity in enabling some of these worst offenses of the decade against democracy and against human rights. And then pretty quickly we watched Facebook step back from a lot of those promises and step back from a lot of those attempts to crack down on misinformation and disinformation, and the way that bad faith actors, including particularly nation states, sort of authoritarian nation states, were using and weaponizing the tools of Facebook and other social media sites to, further their own dictatorial agendas.
It has been so delightful to see more and more listeners like you sign up for NSC Plus. Our growing community is made up of intelligent and thoughtful people looking for a holistic approach to human flourishing. Signing up for NSC Plus is also a way to support the show and the work we're doing, and in fact, we depend upon that kind of support. But in addition to supporting the show, you'll get exclusive access to bonus content, and the No Small Endeavor you've come to love will be completely ad-free. In fact, you won't even hear ads like this one. So go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus to become a member of our community today. Join for as little as $5 a month. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com, click on that red button that says Join NSC Plus to become a member today.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent, savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful, and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast gems.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
So I'd like to I'd like to shift the conversation just a bit and ask about a particular metaphor that gets used often. And you've used it yourself. I've been kind of keeping a tally that I think 5 times in our conversation you've used the word tool to refer to the internet. And so I'd like to explore that just a little bit, and I'd like to start exploring that by this clip from David Wolman. Is that how you pronounce his name, Wolman?
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to begin this conversation by a clip from the journalist David Wolman, who had traveled to Egypt to report about a story in the summer of 2008. Some of the activists there that would contribute to the Arab Spring. And let's listen to this.
Social media is a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or bad, just like a hammer. I got to know people who put it to use in such a spectacular and inspiring way. And now to think about them and how their world hasn't really improved, to say nothing of how divided the United States is, that's sort of gutting. You know, now it is really such a trope, this idea that social media is a tool. And AR-15 is a tool also. Could be used for good, could be used for bad. But let's be a little more honest about how often it's being used for one or the other.
So here Wolman says, okay, the metaphor is a tool. That's the way we should best think about it. And he's using what some philosophers who have written about technology call an instrumental view of technology. That the primary way in which we think about technology should be, or the primary way in which we make ethical judgments about technology should be based upon the end toward which the technology is employed. And thus, in that regard, a tool is a perfect metaphor, right? A hammer can be used for good, a hammer can be used for bad. But there are others who have pushed back on this and suggested that while there are certain ways in which that metaphor can be helpful, because we should be asking about ends and making ethical judgments about the ends toward which we use things, others have kind of pushed back and said, this might be an altogether insufficient metaphor to think about what we're dealing with here. So I particularly like Jacques Ellul, writing in the 20th century, a French sociologist who writes a lot about technology in fascinating ways in the middle of the 20th century. And he kind of pushes back against this and says, no, the much more helpful way to be thinking about technology is what he calls characterology, which is this weird term of saying, what kind of people are we becoming by employing these mechanisms or employing technique? And so I guess my first question here is, I mean, do you find the metaphor of tool sufficient for getting at what you want to get at?
I don't think so. And I think I'm actually very sympathetic to the example that you give there, because I think one of the challenges of wrestling with what the algorithm of social media has done to our society is coming back to what I was talking about, which is it doesn't create new seams. It exacerbates existing ones. And one of the, I think, unfortunate takeaways that we are left with at this moment is the question, is the internet just telling us who we really are? That if the algorithm is accurate, that if it is, really processing everything that we like and don't like, and the things that we watch versus the things that we don't watch, the things that we comment on versus the things that we don't comment on, is it actually just reflecting a honest look at sort of who we are in our sort of darkest heart of hearts. And you know, one of the things I really worry about is the sense of, you know, maybe the internet is right about who we are. And that, you know, one of the challenges of this moment as we watch sort of the collapse of faith in institutions, the, you know, collapse of sort of trustworthy news ecosystems, is, you know, sort of, are we, is the internet showing us that we are sort of all more Hobbesian than we would like to pretend that we are on a daily basis?
And do you think that what do you think the answer to that question is? Do you think that's true or not?
Well, I think that's certainly true in some ways in our politics. Like, I think sort of one of the, I think we are living in a unprecedented moment of politically right now in the United States. But I don't think it's quite as unprecedented as we would like to pretend it is. And that, you know, much of the American history of media and politics involves moments of extreme vitriol and partisan polarization and a partisan and polarizing media environment. You know, that you know, you look at the second half of the 20th century and sort of the Walter Cronkite era of TV news, and I think that across all of the rest of American history is much more the aberration than the norm in terms of, you know, the way that Americans consume sort of objective news information. And obviously the Walter Cronkite era had all sorts of its own blind spots and challenges of objectivity. But that, you know, it did actually represent at least this narrow time period where there was sort of a few major sets of relatively well-vetted sources of information that were coming into our body politic.
Yeah. I mean, I guess from my own take on some of that, I think that you think, for example, about you know, the ring in Lord of the Rings with Gollum,
Mm-hmm.
you know, which goes back to Plato Socrates. You know, the story that they tell about the shepherd boy who discovers the ring that makes him invisible, and then it immediately corrupts him, and he steals, kills, and destroys because he has this power. And I guess I tend to think that there's something about, say, anonymity that we're offered by the internet. There's something about secretiveness and privatization that has no accountability that it seems to me inevitably will foster, in many, many cases, the worst possible version of ourselves, right? And
Yes.
so I don't necessarily think of it as showing who we really are, as facilitating us becoming the worst version of ourselves. Is that fair, you think?
I think that's a great way of looking at it. I'm reading right now Sam Tannehouse's new biography of William F. Buckley, which is just a tremendous book. It's one of the best biographies I've ever read in my life. And Buckley is lamenting at one point, forget whether it was in the 50s or 60s, you know, sort of how poor America's news consumption was and information consumption, and was as an outrageous fact pointing out that, you know, the average American adult only spends 30 minutes a day reading a newspaper. And I was sort of thinking about, man, like, can you imagine if today the average American adult spent 30 minutes reading, a high quality print version of local or national newspaper? Like, just what an incredibly different and better informed country we would have.
Yes. I think one of the most haunting clips that you have in this series is some snippets from Chamath Palihapitiya's speech that he does at Stanford Graduate School. And let's listen to some of this.
Consumer internet businesses are about exploiting psychology. We want to psychologically figure out how to manipulate you as fast as possible and then give you back that dopamine hit. We did that brilliantly at Facebook. Instagram has done it. WhatsApp has done it. You don't realize it, but you are being programmed.
You said that this is a time for soul searching in social media businesses, and you were part of building the largest one. What soul searching are you doing right now on that?
I feel tremendous guilt. I think we all knew in the back of our minds something bad could happen. But I think the way we defined it was not like this. It literally is a point now where I think we have created tools that are ripping apart the social fabric of how society works. The short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. It is eroding the core foundations of how people behave by and between each other. No civil discourse, no cooperation, misinformation, mistruth. We are in a really bad state of affairs right now, in my opinion. If you feed the beast, that beast will destroy you.
Yeah, when you came across this, what was this sort of forthright acknowledgement that this is what the big tech companies have done surprising to you, or did you know enough at this point that this really didn't surprise you?
So this was a startling piece of tape to uncover and play. You know, there's a reason it leads off one of our episodes. But at the same time, I think one of the things that is startling for me across so much of the way that we have seen the leaders of the tech community react to what they have wrought is how many of them have actually sort of turned against their own tools. The number of Silicon Valley tech executives who will, brag like, oh, my kids aren't allowed screen time. I won't get them a phone or let them have social media accounts, until they're in their mid 40s kinds of things. And it's just so striking to me that you wouldn't ever see that in any other industry. Like imagine Mary Barra, talking about, well, I wouldn't ever let my kids drive. Like there's no way, the cars as we make them are just something that like I would never let my own family participate in. Imagine, the scandal of, an Airbus or a Boeing executive being like, my entire family, we take the train to all of our summer vacations because, I just don't believe anyone, can responsibly be using an airplane. And that there's sort of something about the weirdness of, I think, how tech executives have come to understand the damage that their tools can do when used appropriately, sort of when used as intended, that I think makes them much closer to being the sort of cigarette executives of our modern era. And by the way, like, you know, part of what we talk about in our final episode is one of the things I really worry about right now, is the extent to which we sort of seem to be, as a society, speed running all of these same mistakes as we move society towards incorporating and adopting artificial intelligence. And that we sort of sit there and, you know, listen as these AI executives like brag, like, there's a chance my invention will end the world. There's a Dario Modi was saying, just a couple of days ago, like, there's a 25% chance that this, you know, all goes off the rails and destroys the world. And you're like, we wouldn't let any other industry proceed with an invention where its own boosters were forecasting doom so openly, so loudly, and so consistently, without a lot more government guardrails, regulations, safeguards, industry protections. I just really sort of wonder whether this is a moment where, you know, in 15 or 20 years, if there's sort of anyone left to make a podcast, whether there'll be sort of a follow-up podcast season like ours that's like, and executives, knew that they were about to destroy the world with AI and just forged right ahead.
Well, I mean, why do you think, what's your narrative on the reticence to take seriously oversight?
So this is something that I've actually spent a lot of time on across, probably 20 or 25 years of my career at this point, which is government has just utterly failed in appropriately understanding or regulating this era of technology. And there are a couple of different reasons for that. One is the speed with which these technologies have transformed the world, is just a speed that is faster than government and, legislative bodies are really able to work. It takes, 5 years on average for a piece of legislation in Congress to go from introduction to passage and enactment. And 5 years in technology is an enormous period of time. That like, if you sort of calculate that out, basically like we're still working our way right now through legislation that was, mostly written before COVID right now, which is sort of a stunning way to sort of think about how far behind in legislating our daily lives we are. The second thing, and I don't think we can underestimate this, is the gerontocracy that we have seen sort of overwhelm American politics, particularly in the last decade, but really across the last 15 or 20 years more broadly, where you have, most of the people who are making laws about our technology in Congress, most of our, most of the people who have been in the White House in the last 20 years have never used any of this technology natively. And, it's really hard to understand how all of these technologies actually impact your daily life if you are one of the members of Congress who, still has your staff print out emails for you, and then you handwrite note responses to them. We talk about in the podcast that sort of incredible moment where Mark Zuckerberg is appearing on Capitol Hill after the Rohingya genocide, after the 2016 election, and you have members of Congress asking him, "How do you make money?" And he's like, "We sell advertising," which is like literal news to the members of Congress on the committee that is supposed to be regulating Facebook.
Yeah. So in the middle of all this, do you, again, in your heart of hearts, do you think that these sorts of business models are fundamentally compatible or incompatible with democratic civic life?
It's a really good question. And contrary to everything that you have heard me talk about in the rest of this interview, I'm a very hopeful person. I'm, sort of fundamentally optimistic about the direction of the world. And I am, my own tech enthusiast. I was a early blogger in the 2000s. I was actually the first blogger accredited to cover a White House press briefing in 20 years ago, literally, and have always been an early adopter of these tools and technologies. And yet, much like a lot of the other tech executives that we were just talking about, like, I now am the parent of 2 young kids and, am doing everything that I can possibly do to shelter them from, anything having to do with the internet or social media or cell phones, and, have really complicated and mixed feelings about my own relationship to these technologies. I'm a journalist, and so I spend an enormous portion of my day reading social media, and it's how I stay informed, and it's how I know how to write about the things that I want to write about, and it's where I find sources. And, I feel at the end of the evening just as dirty as everyone when I sort of am sitting there scrolling mindlessly through Instagram, for much longer than I want to be. And I don't really know how to undo this. I know that there are people who are hard at work on it. There are people who really believe that they can build a better civic square for us. And I don't know that I am optimistic about that.
What would you say if you had a magic wand, you could make one change regarding the internet or technology or the history of the unfolding of technology? What would that one thing be? One sentence.
Oh, that's an amazing question. I think that part of the challenge is there is not a single change to all of this. And that a lot of what we are living through online also is downstream from and follows problems that we have had offline. And, one of the things that I think a lot about, I wrote a book a couple of years ago about Watergate. And then how so much of what we are living through right now is downstream from the collapse of faith and trust in institutions that took place in that Watergate era, which also encompasses Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers and Nixon's crimes and the Church and Pike committees about the abuses of civil rights and civil liberties by government intelligence and law enforcement and the military. And I think, again, coming back to this theme that technology doesn't create new problems, it facilitates existing ones. I think a lot of what we are living through online today is downstream from, problems that existed in our body politic and our national civic fabric, well before the internet arrived.
You mentioned a moment ago that you're aware of your own failings and habits like all the rest of us have with regard to technology. But I wonder, with all of the research that you've done in this regard, are there certain constructive habits that you've put in place that have been important to you in response to all that you've learned?
It wasn't something that I learned sort of specifically in this work, but one thing I actually do in my own social media life is on Instagram, I've turned on the function that allows you to set sort of a daily 15-minute limit for consuming it. And I will be truthful and accountable on the podcast here by saying that you can also ignore it and then have it just remind you at future subsequent 15-minute increments that you're still using Instagram. But I find that actually is an enormously helpful way to sort of interrupt my desire to just keep strolling endlessly online.
2 books maybe you would suggest that everybody ought to read on technology and where we find ourselves in this current moment?
So to me, actually, there's a book that actually is featured very prominently in 2 of our seasons now, that is by Joan Donovan and a couple of other co-authors, Emily Dreyfus and Brian Friedberg, that's called Meme Wars, The Untold Story of the Online Battles Upending Our Democracy. And it's a really thoughtful, book-length look at the last, 10 years of American politics. We used it actually pretty extensively in our season, looking at the rise of the American far right, and then also, of course, in this season, looking at the rise of the sort of rise and fall of the internet, and then there's another book by 2 New York Times reporters, Shira Frankel and Cecilia Kang, that's about Facebook, called An Ugly Truth: Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, that came out a number of years ago, that I found, I think it came out in 2021, that I remember reading at the time, and I thought was one of the best books that I had read that year, and really helped me sort of understand and contextualize this thing that we had all been living through together, and how and why Facebook ended up doing the things that it did.
Been talking to Garrett Graff, host of the Edward R. Murrow award-winning podcast Long Shadow, especially on season 4, Breaking the internet. Garrett, thanks so much for the conversation. Remarkable. And thank you for all the good work you're doing in the world to help us see things that we're not seeing otherwise.
Thanks so much for a great conversation.
It's easy to know you want to make a change in your life, but it is hard to actually do it. How to Be a Better Human from TED is a podcast for when self-help feels too daunting or just not for you. I'm Chris Duffy, the host of How to Be a Better Human, and trust me, I do not have it all figured out. But join me as I talk to experts about actually attainable ways we can try to improve our lives. Whether it's facing fears, setting boundaries, cleaning your house, or all sorts of other topics. Find How to Be a Better Human wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, Finney. Did you think our story was over?
Mr. Grabber.
This Friday.
You're dead.
Dead is just a word.
Critics are saying Ethan Hawke is pure nightmare fuel.
Oh, Finney.
Discover the secret behind the mask.
What do you think happens when you die? It's time to find out.
Black Phone 2, only in theaters Friday. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku. And it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.
If you love No Small Endeavor, I suspect you will not want to miss joining us in Nashville for our Thanksgiving variety show on November 23. This year, we'll be joined by Sharon McMahon, #1 New York Times bestselling author and podcaster. Sharon is a longtime government and law educator who became known as America's government teacher during the 2020 election when she went viral for breaking down complex topics with a steadfast commitment to the facts. It'll be a night of thoughtful conversation, moving music, and a room full of folks all in pursuit of no small endeavor. This year it's at the beautiful Skirmerhorn Symphony Center here in Nashville. We'll be joined by the Choir Room, Grammy award-winning artist Allison Russell, and a full band for an amazing night you will not want to miss. Mark your calendars for November 23, and don't wait. Go get your tickets now at the link in the show notes or at nosmallendeavor.com/events.